Behind the gilded gates of palaces and the polished smiles of monarchs, there are whispers too dangerous to speak aloud, secrets so explosive they could shatter the very image of royalty. Picture this, a letter locked away for decades, its contents so scandalous that even the most powerful figures trembled at the thought of it being revealed. This isn't fiction, it's the hidden truth of royal families, where power, betrayal, and forbidden love have been carefully buried beneath centuries of tradition and propaganda. What if I told you that some of these secrets were so shocking they nearly toppled thrones, from illicit affairs that defied the strictest protocols to covert alliances that rewrote history? The royal world is a labyrinth of untold stories. Take, for instance, the rumored affair between a certain queen and her trusted advisor, a relationship so volatile it threatened to ignite a constitutional crisis. Or the heir to a throne, whose true parentage was concealed behind a web of lies, all to preserve the illusion of dynasty. These aren't just gossip, they're real, documented moments where the line between duty and desire blurred beyond recognition. And yet, they've been scrubbed from official records, hidden in private vaults, or silenced by those with everything to lose. But why do these secrets matter now? Because they reveal the humanity and hypocrisy behind the crowns. For every grand coronation or carefully staged public appearance, there's a shadow history of passion, scandal, and ruthless ambition. Some of these stories were deemed too dangerous to survive, their witnesses paid off or exiled. Others were buried so deep that only fragments remain, waiting to be pieced together like a puzzle. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the most explosive royal family secrets, the ones that were almost lost to time. This is more than just a glimpse behind the scenes. It's a journey into the heart of power, where the truth was never meant to see the light. So, are you ready to uncover what they tried so desperately to hide? History has a way of rewriting itself when it comes to royal bloodlines, especially when those bloodlines weren't supposed to exist at all. Imagine a child, born with the features of a king, the bearing of a queen, yet condemned to live in the shadows simply because their birth defied the rigid rules of monarchy. Illegitimate children were the dirty little secret of every royal court, and some of Europe's most powerful dynasties went to extraordinary lengths to cover them up. Take King Edward IV of England, for instance. His reign was already turbulent, but when he died suddenly, whispers about his marriage, or rather, its questionable validity, threw the entire succession into chaos. Two young princes, Edward V and his brother Richard, were declared illegitimate by their own uncle, who then seized the throne as Richard III. Were the boys truly born outside of a lawful marriage, or was it simply a convenient lie to remove them from power? The mystery deepened when the princes vanished from the Tower of London, their fates still debated centuries later. Then there's Queen Victoria, the stern-faced monarch who ruled an empire yet may have harbored a scandal of her own. Rumors swirled that her eldest daughter, Princess Vicky, secretly gave birth to an illegitimate child while in Prussia, a grandchild Victoria would never publicly acknowledge. If true, the child would have been whisked away, raised under an assumed name, their royal heritage erased to avoid tarnishing the crown. These weren't isolated cases. Across Europe, children born on the wrong side of the royal bed were quietly exiled, married off to obscure nobility, or even, in the darkest cases, disappeared entirely. The records were altered, the portraits destroyed, the whispers suppressed, because in a world where bloodline was everything, the truth could be the most dangerous weapon of all. Love has always been the Achilles heel of royalty, a force powerful enough to make kings abandon crowns and princesses risk everything. Few scandals illustrate this better than the story of King Edward VIII. who chose passion over power in a decision that sent shockwaves through the British Empire. Here was a monarch willing to throw away centuries of tradition for Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee deemed unacceptable by the establishment, the government, the church. Even his own family warned him marrying her would mean abdication. And yet, in December 1936, he stunned the world by stepping down with a single radio address, declaring, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman I love." Overnight, the king became a duke, exiled to France with Wallis while the monarchy scrambled to rebuild its credibility. Behind closed doors, documents were burned, letters vanished, and officials spun the narrative to portray Edward as reckless rather than romantic, because the truth that love could dismantle a throne was too dangerous to admit. Then there was Princess Margaret, the Queen's fiery younger sister, who nearly replicated Edward's scandal 2 decades later. Her love for Group Captain Peter Townsend, a war hero 16 years her senior, seemed like a fairy tale until the palace intervened. Townsend was divorced, and in the eyes of the church and crown, that made him unfit for a royal marriage. Margaret was given an ultimatum: give him up or lose her title, her income, even her place in the family. Unlike Edward, she chose duty over desire publicly, at least. Privately, their affair allegedly continued for years, hidden through secret meetings and coded letters. The establishment's message was clear: personal happiness would always come second to the monarchy's survival, but these weren't isolated incidents. Across Europe, royal hearts were breaking under the weight of protocol. In Spain, King Alfonso XIII's wife, Victoria Eugenie, endured whispers that her hemophiliac son wasn't the king's at all, a rumor allegedly spread by Alfonso himself to justify his own string of mistresses. In Belgium, Queen Astrid's tragic death in a car crash spawned lurid speculation that her husband, King Leopold III, had been driving recklessly during a lover's quarrel. Even today, the Danish royal family refuses to acknowledge the full extent of Queen Margaret II's husband's infidelities, despite decades of tabloid leaks. What makes these affairs so explosive isn't just the betrayal, it's the hypocrisy. Royalty demanded unwavering loyalty from the public while quietly rewriting the rules for themselves. For every public sermon about morality, there were private bargains struck to hide illegitimate children, silence mistresses, or banish unwanted spouses to remote estates. The truth was always malleable when it threatened the crown's image, and yet these very scandals humanized the royals, exposing the messy, vulnerable hearts beating beneath the ermine robes and tiaras. Because in the end, no amount of power could shield them from the one force capable of toppling any dynasty: love. Few events have fueled conspiracy theories like the tragic death of Princess Diana. A car crash in a Paris tunnel on August 31st, 1997, may have claimed her life, but the mystery surrounding that night has only grown darker with time. Officially, it was a tragic accident, a drunk driver, a high-speed chase, and a fatal collision, but whispers of something far more sinister began almost immediately. Why were the paparazzi so relentless that night? Why did Diana's bodyguard, the only survivor, later claim he remembered nothing? And most chilling of all, could the royal family itself have played a role in silencing the people's princess? One of the most explosive theories revolves around the Paul Burrell tapes. Diana's former butler, a man who knew her most intimate secrets, claimed she had written a letter predicting her own murder. "They're planning an accident in my car," she allegedly wrote, referring to unnamed powerful figures who wanted her out of the way. The timing of her death, just as she was embracing a new life with Dodi Fade, a Muslim man, and preparing to expose royal secrets, raised eyebrows worldwide. Even Dodi's father, Mohammed Al Fayed, spent years insisting the crash was orchestrated, pointing to erased CCTV footage, missing medical records, and the suspicious deaths of key witnesses. Then there's the unsettling haste of the investigation. The French inquiry concluded it was an accident, but British authorities resisted reopening the case for years. When they finally did, key evidence seemed to vanish. The driver's blood samples, which allegedly showed lethal levels of alcohol, were later disputed. The Mercedes itself was crushed and melted down before independent forensic teams could examine it, and Henry Paul, the driver, was a former intelligence asset, a detail that only deepened suspicions. Perhaps the most haunting question of all, what did Diana know that made her a threat? By 1997, she had become a loose cannon, divorced from Prince Charles, openly criticizing the monarchy, and on the verge of exposing scandals that could have shaken the institution to its core. Her charity work with AIDS patients and landmine victims had already defied royal protocol. Would she have gone further? We'll never know for sure. But what we do know is this: nearly 3 decades later, the public still doesn't trust the official story. And in the shadowy world of royal power, that alone speaks volumes, the night of July 17th, 1918, remains one of the darkest in royal history, the moment the Romanov dynasty was erased in a hail of bullets. Officially, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were executed by Bolshevik revolutionaries in a basement in Yekaterinburg, their bodies dumped in a shallow grave. But the official story is riddled with gaps, contradictions, and whispers of a cover-up so vast it stretched across continents. Take the forensic evidence, or lack of it. When the mass grave was finally discovered in 1991, 2 bodies were missing: Alexei, the heir to the throne, and one of his sisters, later identified as Maria. Their absence sparked decades of speculation. Had they somehow escaped? Were their bodies destroyed separately to prevent relics of the monarchy from becoming rallying points? Then there's the chilling condition of the remains. The skull showed signs of brutal bludgeoning, and the family's jewels had been sewn into their clothes, a last-ditch effort to smuggle wealth, or perhaps a desperate disguise. But the most explosive rumors involve survivors. For years, women across Europe claimed to be Anastasia, the youngest Romanov daughter, spinning tales of being rescued by sympathetic guards. The most famous pretender, Anna Anderson, spent 60 years in legal battles, her story detailed enough to convince some relatives, yet debunked by DNA testing in 1994. Then there's the account of a Bolshevik officer who confessed on his deathbed to sparing 2 children, spiriting them away in the chaos. No evidence ever confirmed it, but the myth persists because the alternative, the murder of innocent children, was too monstrous to accept. And where was Britain in all this? King George V, Nicholas's first cousin, had been begged to offer the Romanovs asylum as revolution swept Russia. Private letters reveal he initially agreed, even arranging a warship, until his government warned him, harboring that Tsar could radicalize British workers, destabilizing a nation already weary from World War I. The offer was quietly withdrawn. After the murders, the royal family's silence was deafening. No public mourning, no condemnation, just a swift recognition of the new Soviet regime. Decades later, palace memos surfaced showing George feared his own throne might be next if he appeared too sympathetic to fallen royalty. The Romanov story didn't end in that basement. Fragments of bone, rediscovered in 2007, finally confirmed Alexei and Maria's fates. Yet even now, the Russian Orthodox Church refuses to acknowledge the remains as authentic, fueling conspiracy theories. Because some truths are too explosive to confront, especially when they force us to ask who, exactly, benefited from the Romanovs' erasure. Was it just the revolutionaries? Or were there quieter hands in palaces far away who found it convenient to look the other way? For 4 decades, Elizabeth I ruled England under one unshakable title, the Virgin Queen. Her refusal to marry became legendary, a strategic masterpiece that kept rivals and suitors at bay while she wielded power alone. But what if the most carefully crafted image in royal history was just that, an image? Whispers have lingered for centuries that Elizabeth's most famous virtue was a political smokescreen, concealing a scandal so explosive it could have rewritten the Tudor dynasty. At the center of the rumors stood Robert Dudley, the Queen's childhood friend and lifelong confidant. Their bond was no secret. Elizabeth famously called him her eyes, and courtiers noted how she flushed when he entered a room. But were they simply close friends, or something far more dangerous? In 1562, Elizabeth fell gravely ill with smallpox, and in her delirium, she reportedly begged her counselors to make Dudley protector of the realm, should she die. The request raised eyebrows. Why would a queen with no heir entrust her kingdom to a man with no royal blood? Unless, of course, he held a far more personal stake in her legacy. Then there's the mysterious case of Arthur Dudley, a man who surfaced decades later in Spain, claiming to be Elizabeth and Robert's secret son. Captured by Spanish forces in the 1580s, Arthur told interrogators he'd been raised in secrecy, shuffled between loyal households to avoid detection. The Spanish, eager to discredit the Protestant queen, documented his testimony in meticulous detail. But was Arthur a clever impostor, or evidence of a royal cover-up? English records from the period show sudden, unexplained payments to obscure country estates, perhaps to silence caretakers or fund a hidden upbringing. The implications are staggering. Had Elizabeth borne a child, every decision of her reign would have been reinterpreted. Her refusal to marry wasn't just political genius, it was necessity. A secret heir would have undermined her carefully cultivated image of divine, untouchable sovereignty. Worse, it could have plunged England into civil war, with rival factions backing either the hidden child or James I of Scotland, Elizabeth's eventual successor. Perhaps the most telling clue lies in Elizabeth's own words. On her deathbed, she reportedly whispered, "All my possessions for one moment of time. Was this merely a dying woman's regret?" Or the lament of a mother who'd spent a lifetime denying her own child. The truth may lie buried in the Tudor archives, locked away by those who understood some secrets are too dangerous to survive. Because in the Game of Thrones, the greatest power isn't just ruling, it's controlling what history remembers. The story of King Edward VIII didn't end with his abdication. It descended into something far darker. Behind the romanticized tale of a king who gave up his throne for love lies a scandal so explosive it was nearly erased from history: his alarming ties to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. While the world saw a love-struck exile, British intelligence was tracking something far more sinister: a former monarch whose allegiances had shifted dangerously toward the enemy. The classified documents reveal Edward wasn't just sympathetic to the Nazis, he actively aided them. During his post-abdication tour of Germany in 1937, he was photographed giving full Nazi salutes, dining with high-ranking officials, and even meeting Hitler himself at the Berghof. Eyewitnesses reported the two spoke privately for hours, with Edward allegedly praising Hitler's economic policies and suggesting Britain should avoid war with Germany at all costs. But it wasn't just idle admiration. Secret memos from British spies detail how Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, passed sensitive information to the Nazis through Wallis Simpson's social circle information that could have compromised Allied operations. One intercepted letter even showed him urging continued bombing of Britain to force a surrender, calling it the only way to end the suffering. The royal family's panic was palpable. As war loomed, Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered the Duke relocated to the Bahamas as governor, a glorified exile meant to keep him far from Nazi collaborators. Yet even there, Edward couldn't resist meddling. Cables between German embassies referred to him as Operation Willy, a potential puppet ruler if Britain fell. After the war, the truth became so radioactive that MI5 confiscated and sealed hundreds of files, some of which remain classified to this day. Palace aides worked overtime to scrub his name from records, even pressuring biographers to downplay his actions. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from the Duke's own mouth. In a 1966 interview, he casually admitted, "I never thought Hitler was such a bad chap." The remark was cut from the final broadcast, but the tapes survived. For the royal family, Edward wasn't just an embarrassment, he was a living, breathing threat to the monarchy's survival. His actions forced them into an impossible position: disown him publicly and risk exposing the crown's vulnerability, or shield him and let the lie fester. They chose the latter, burying the truth so deep that even now, the full extent of his betrayal may never be known. The question lingers: how much did Wallis Simpson know? Declassified FBI files describe her as the driving force behind Edward's Nazi leanings, with sources claiming she fed information to her lover, a German diplomat. Others argue Edward was merely a pawn, manipulated by those who saw his bitterness over exile as a weapon. Either way, the Duke's treachery remains one of the royal family's most closely guarded secrets, not just because it stains their legacy, but because it proves how easily the line between royalty and ruin can blur. While the British monarchy's secrets were buried under pomp and protocol, the Medici dynasty's scandals unfolded with a far more brutal flair, blending poison, betrayal, and Vatican collusion into a recipe for absolute power. This wasn't just political maneuvering, it was a family business built on blood. Take Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch who turned banking into a weapon. His gold financed wars and popes, but his true legacy was the shadow network of assassins and apothecaries ensuring rivals met untimely ends. One notorious example: the sudden demise of Baldaccio d'Anghiari, a mercenary captain who dared defy Medici interests. Officially, he fell during a skirmish. Privately, court records hint at a more sinister end: a stomach ailment after dining with Cosimo's associates. Then there was Lorenzo the Magnificent, the Renaissance prince, who mastered the art of plausible deniability. When the Pazzi family plotted to overthrow the Medicis during Easter Mass in 1478, Lorenzo survived the assassination attempt barely. His brother Giuliano wasn't so lucky, stabbed 19 times before the altar. Lorenzo's revenge was swift and savage. Every Pazzi conspirator was hunted down, their bodies hanged from Palazzo della Signoria's windows. But the real shocker, Vatican involvement: Pope Sixtus IV, who'd secretly blessed the plot, quickly distanced himself, declaring the Medicis God's chosen rulers. The message was clear: cross the family, and even the church wouldn't save you. Poisoned, though, was the Medici signature. Contessina de' Bardi, wife to Cosimo, allegedly kept a garden of toxic plants disguised as medicinal herbs. Her most infamous creation, the inheritance powder, reserved for wealthy relatives whose wills needed adjusting. Centuries later, forensic tests on the exhumed remains of Francesco, the first, and his second wife, Bianca Capello, revealed lethal arsenic levels. The official story: they died hours apart from malaria. The truth: a double murder likely orchestrated by Francesco's brother, Cardinal Ferdinando, who seized their estates and, conveniently, the ducal throne. The Vatican's role in whitewashing Medici crimes reveals the darkest irony of all. When Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X, he turned the Holy See into a family PR machine. Critics excommunicated, incriminating documents lost from the archives, even the brutal reign of Alessandro de' Medici, whose orgies and executions horrified Florence, was recast as firm governance after his cousin became Pope Clement VII. The ultimate cover-up came in 1532, when Clement secretly absolved Alessandro for murdering his own kin, declaring the act necessary for peace. What makes the Medici scandal so chilling isn't just their ruthlessness, it's how seamlessly they twisted faith, art, and politics into tools of oppression. They commissioned masterpieces to glorify their name while hiring hitmen to silence dissent. They built cathedrals with one hand and slipped poison into chalices with the other. And when history threatened to expose them, they had an eternal failsafe, a pope in the family, because in the end, the Medici motto might as well have been, God forgives. We don't. King Henry VIII's court was a battlefield of ambition, where even royal blood wasn't enough to guarantee survival. Enter Henry Fitzroy, the king's only acknowledged illegitimate son, a living, breathing complication in the Tudor succession crisis. Born to Henry's mistress Elizabeth Blount in 1519, the boy was showered with titles: Duke of Richmond, Lord Admiral of England, even a symbolic marriage to the Duke of Norfolk's daughter. For a king desperate for male heirs, Fitzroy was both a blessing and a threat proof of Henry's virility, yet a potential rival to any legitimate sons. Then, at just 17 years old, the young duke collapsed suddenly in July 1536, dying in agony after what court physicians called a consumption of the lungs. But whispers in the corridors of power told a darker tale. Had someone removed the boy to tidy up the line of succession, the timing alone raises eyebrows. Fitzroy's death came just 10 days after Parliament passed the Second Succession Act, declaring Henry's daughters Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate, and mere months before Jane Seymour announced her pregnancy with the future Edward VI. With Fitzroy gone, the path was cleared for a new heir. Suspicion fell on Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who'd reportedly clashed with the Duke over religious reforms. Then there was Anne Boleyn's faction, still reeling from her execution weeks earlier. A surviving letter from the Spanish ambassador notes great suspicion of foul play, adding that Fitzroy had dined with Cromwell shortly before falling ill. Even the autopsy, conducted in secret, was suspiciously vague. No mention of the froth typically seen in poisoning cases, yet observers noted his body turned unnaturally black post-mortem. But the real bombshell lies in Fitzroy's final hours. Contemporary accounts claim he confessed to a priest that he'd been given a drink to settle his stomach by an unnamed servant. The priest, bound by the confessional seal, took the secret to his grave. Modern historians point to arsenic, the perfect weapon for a discreet assassination. It mimics natural illness, and Fitzroy's symptoms, violent vomiting, crushing chest pain, match chronic arsenic poisoning. The killer wouldn't have needed a dramatic dose. Just small amounts in his wine over months would have done the trick. What makes this scandal so explosive isn't just the potential murder, it's the hypocrisy. Henry had spent years annulling marriages and executing wives to secure a male heir, yet when nature handed him a healthy son, that son conveniently perished as a new queen carried Henry's next hope. The official records were scrubbed clean, Fitzroy's name faded from court chronicles, and within years, it was as if he'd never existed, because in the Tudor court, some truths were too dangerous to survive, especially when they hinted that the king's desperation might have cost his own child's life. For centuries, the Habsburg dynasty ruled vast swaths of Europe under a single, unchallenged belief: their blood was too sacred to dilute. Kings married cousins, uncles wed nieces, and siblings became spouses, all in the name of preserving power. But this obsession with purity came at a horrific cost, one the family went to extraordinary lengths to conceal. The Habsburgs didn't just inbreed, they created a genetic time bomb, and the fallout was written on their children's bodies. Take Charles II of Spain, the most infamous product of this toxic legacy. By the time he took the throne in 1665, his family tree was less a tree and more a tangled knot. His parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents were first cousins, and his great-grandparents practically repeated the same pattern. The results were catastrophic. Charles couldn't chew properly due to a grotesquely elongated jaw, a condition now known as the Habsburg chin. His tongue was so swollen he drooled constantly, and he suffered seizures so violent they left him bedridden for weeks. Worse still, he was intellectually disabled, unable to read or govern, forcing Spain into decline under a king who could barely function. When he died childless at 38, an autopsy revealed his corpse contained barely a drop of untainted blood. His organs were deformed, his heart shrunken, his brain riddled with fluid. But Charles wasn't an anomaly. Generations of Habsburgs bore similar scars. Joanna of Castile, locked away as mad for decades, likely suffered from severe depression and paranoia exacerbated by generations of inbreeding. Her grandson, Rudolph II, exhibited such erratic behavior, collecting occult artifacts, refusing to bathe, conversing with imaginary voices, that his own court plotted to depose him. Even the family's portraits tell a damning story. The same protruding lower lips, sunken eyes, and elongated faces repeat like a cursed mirror across centuries. Desperate to hide this unraveling genetic code, the Habsburgs turned to censorship on an industrial scale. Official court painters were ordered to adjust portraits, softening deformities or repainting entire features. Birth records of stillborn or disfigured infants were burned, their names struck from genealogies. When Archduke Karl Ludwig's children began displaying terrifying symptoms, uncontrollable tremors, skeletal malformations, their existence was erased entirely, their portraits slashed from family galleries. Even physicians were silenced. One doctor who dared document the family's hereditary illnesses in 1723 was exiled to a remote monastery, his notes confiscated. The most chilling evidence of this cover-up lies in the crypts beneath Vienna's Capuchin Church, where generations of Habsburgs are interred. Forensic anthropologists found infant coffins deliberately placed in unmarked niches. DNA testing revealed multiple cases of catastrophic birth defects, babies with fused limbs, exposed spines, even conjoined twins, all buried in secret. These weren't just tragedies, they were proof of a dynasty's vanity, because for the Habsburgs, power wasn't just about ruling, it was about maintaining the illusion of divine perfection, no matter how many lives it destroyed. In the end, their obsession with purity became their undoing. The Spanish Habsburgs collapsed with Charles's death, their lineage snuffed out by their own hands. The Austrian branch limped on, but the damage was done. Centuries of inbreeding left them vulnerable to rivals, their once mighty empire crumbling under the weight of their genetic decay. It's a grim lesson written in twisted DNA and buried records. No amount of gold, no claim to divinity, can cheat biology, and when a family spends generations trying to outrun the truth always wins. The fog of 19th century London hid more than just the grime of Whitacapelle Street. Sit concealed whispers that one of history's most notorious killers might have worn a crown. Prince Albert Victor, grandson to Queen Victoria and second in line to the throne, was an unlikely suspect in the Jack the Ripper murders, yet for over a century, theorists have pieced together a chilling case that the palace may have orchestrated the ultimate cover-up to protect him. At first glance, the prince seemed an improbable villain, Educated at Cambridge, a naval officer, and by all accounts a sensitive young man, Albert Victor, known to his family as Eddie, who showed no outward signs of violence. But scratch beneath the surface, and the shadows deepen. In 1888, the same year the Ripper terrorized London, Eddie was allegedly sent to a mental asylum in Switzerland under heavy guard. Officially, he was recovering from a nervous breakdown. Unofficially, his abrupt disappearance coincided precisely with the Ripper's killing spree, only for the murders to mysteriously cease when he returned. The evidence, though circumstantial, is startling. Witnesses described the Ripper as a tall, well-spoken man with surgical precision details that matched Eddie's physique and his medical training. One victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was butchered in a room with an almost ceremonial brutality, her heart missing. A palace ledger from that week shows an unexplained payment to an East End mortuary, while a servant's diary later surfaced alleging the prince kept souvenirs in a locked box. Then there's the curious case of Sir William Gull, Queen Victoria's personal physician. Conspiracy theorists claim Gull was spotted near a murder scene, supposedly tasked with discreetly containing Eddie's crimes. When Gull suffered a stroke weeks later, his incoherent ramblings reportedly included phrases like "the blood of the whores" and "the prince's secret." The palace's response: Gull's medical records vanished, and his family received a hefty, quiet pension, but the most damning clue lies in Parliament's archives. A 1963 memo from a senior civil servant warned that releasing certain Victorian-era files could compromise the dignity of the crown. Those files remain sealed, their contents known only to a handful of officials. Were they proof of Eddie's involvement, or evidence of a frantic royal family burning letters, bribing witnesses, and rewriting history to shield their own? The truth may be buried in an unmarked grave, just like the Ripper's victims, because in a world where monarchs were considered divine, some secrets weren't just scandalous. They were blasphemy, and blasphemy had a way of disappearing into the London fog, never to be seen again. The French Revolution didn't just topple a monarchy, it sparked the greatest treasure hunt in history. As mobs stormed the Tuileries Palace in 1792, the royal family's most priceless possessions vanished overnight. The crown jewels of France, a glittering hoard of diamonds, rubies, and gold accumulated over centuries, were supposed to fund the new republic. But when officials opened the royal vaults, they found gaping holes where the treasures once lay. Some pieces had been smuggled out by loyalists, others looted in the chaos, but the most shocking revelation: many never resurfaced at all, becoming the stuff of legend and whispered deals between rival monarchs. Take the infamous Sancy diamond, a pale yellow gem once worn by Marie Antoinette. Last seen in the Queen's private chambers, it disappeared during her imprisonment. Decades later, a nearly identical diamond appeared in the collection of Russia's Tsar Alexander I, who claimed it was a gift from a French exile. The timing was suspicious. Alexander had secretly funded royalist plots to restore the Bourbons. Was this a payoff for his support? The Russian imperial inventory listed it as acquired through diplomatic channels, but when Bolshevik revolutionaries seized the Romanov jewels in 1917, the Sancy was notably absent from their records. To this day, no one knows if it was stolen, sold, or still hides in some forgotten vault beneath the Kremlin. Then there's the French blue, a massive blue diamond that vanished during the revolution's bloodiest days. Cut from the original Tavernier diamond, it was last documented in 1792, but 50 years later, a strikingly similar stone, now called the Hope Diamond, has surfaced in London, owned by a banker with ties to King George IV. The British royal family has always denied any connection, but leaked correspondence from the Hanoverian archives reveals frantic negotiations between George and French royalists in the 1820s, discussing the return of certain assets in exchange for political favors. The Hope Diamond's eerie resemblance to the French blue isn't just coincidence, it's a ghost of stolen royalty. Perhaps the most brazen heist involved the Regent Diamond, a flawless gem Napoleon later wore in his sword's hilt. When revolutionaries seized it, they displayed it proudly as a trophy of the people until it was swapped with a fake during a routine cleaning. The culprit, a network of royalist jewelers who smuggled it to Spain, where King Carlos IV quietly acquired it. When Napoleon demanded its return in 1810, Spanish officials produced paperwork claiming it had been legally purchased. The truth: Carlos's agents had paid off the entire French Treasury Board to falsify records, but the greatest mystery surrounds the Mazarin diamonds, a set of 18 rare stones collected by Cardinal Mazarin. Listed as lost during the Revolution, they reappeared one by one over the next century, always in the hands of European royals. Queen Victoria acquired 2 through a shady dealer in 1843, while the Dutch crown jewels mysteriously gained 3 more after a private donation from an unnamed French noble. The most damning evidence lies in a letter from Leopold I of Belgium to his niece, Queen Victoria, boasting that the Mazarin pieces are safest when scattered among friends. Modern efforts to reclaim these treasures have hit brick walls. In 2007, France's Culture Ministry demanded the Louvre investigate the British crown jewels' origins, but Buckingham Palace blocked access, citing sovereign immunity. Private collectors are even more secretive. When a Saudi prince auctioned a legendary ruby necklace in 2019, French archivists recognized it as part of Marie Antoinette's collection. The prince's lawyers produced a bill of sale dated 1794, signed by a revolutionary official later executed for embezzlement. The document's authenticity highly questionable, but in the shadowy world of royal treasures, possession isn't just 9/10 of the law, it's the only law that matters. What makes these stolen jewels so explosive isn't just their value, it's the hypocrisy. European monarchies that condemned the French Revolution as barbaric were simultaneously fencing its loot, then rewriting history to claim legitimate ownership. And while governments today plead ignorance, the paper trail doesn't lie, because when it comes to royal treasure, the greatest heist wasn't the theft, it was convincing the world these jewels were never stolen at all. Marie Antoinette's downfall wasn't just a public spectacle, it was a desperate cat and mouse game fought in shadows, with secret allies and coded letters. Behind the gilded bars of the Tuileries and later the Temple prison, the doomed queen wasn't sitting idle. She was orchestrating one of history's most audacious escape plots, a plan so intricate it involved Swedish nobility, stolen uniforms, and a fortune in hidden diamonds. The real tragedy: it almost worked. The mastermind behind the operation was Count Axel von Fersen, a Swedish aristocrat and the Queen's rumored lover. While Paris celebrated the revolution, Fersen was funneling money to royalist networks, bribing guards, and even commissioning a custom-built carriage disguised as a merchant's coach. The plan was straightforward: smuggle the royal family out in stages, using decoys and forged passports, but the first attempt in June 1791 unraveled spectacularly. Louis XVI, ever the reluctant conspirator, insisted on leaving behind a manifesto condemning the revolution, delaying their departure just long enough for a vigilant postmaster to recognize the king's face from currency. The family was captured in Varennes, dragged back to Paris as traitors, and the world watched as their last shred of dignity dissolved, yet Fersen refused to give up. His second scheme was even bolder: a paid uprising by the National Guard to storm the Temple prison. Secret letters, written in invisible ink between the lines of innocuous books, detailed the plot. Marie Antoinette's coded plea to her allies survives: "We are guarded like wild beasts," but the plan leaked when a bribed guard betrayed them for a larger reward. The consequences were brutal. The Queen was moved to a smaller cell, her remaining jewels confiscated, and her correspondence monitored by spies. Even her 10-year-old son, Louis Charles, was taken from her, turned against his mother by revolutionary tutors who forced him to accuse her of incest. The most heartbreaking twist, a final nearly successful attempt in August 1793, just weeks before her execution. A royalist sympathizer had swapped the prison's rosters, arranging for Marie Antoinette to be transferred under guard, only for those guards to be royalists in disguise. The escape was set for midnight, but at the last moment, a patrol changed its route unexpectedly, spotting the conspirators. The Queen, dressed as a servant, was recognized by her famously graceful hands. What makes these failed escapes so haunting isn't just the near misses, it's the chilling efficiency of the revolutionary machine that crushed them. Every bribe had a counter-bribe, every ally a double agent. And in the end, Marie Antoinette's greatest mistake wasn't arrogance or extravagance. It was underestimating how desperately the revolution needed her as a symbol of everything they destroyed. Because dead queens make martyrs, but escaped ones, they make revolutions look weak, and that was a risk France's new rulers couldn't afford. If ever there was a pope who turned the Vatican into a den of vice, it was Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI. His reign wasn't just controversial, it was a masterclass in corruption, where holy robes hid poison vials and papal decrees were written in blood. Elected in 1492 through outright bribery, his rivals later claimed he outright bought votes with chests of gold. Alexander redefined the papacy as a family business, where murder, debauchery, and outright theft were just another day's work. Take the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, a party so depraved even his contemporaries struggled to describe it. Historical accounts detail how Alexander hosted 50 courtesans in the Apostolic Palace, rewarding them with gold for performing with guests in front of the papal throne. But the true scandal wasn't the orgy, it was the guest list. Cardinals, diplomats, even foreign dignitaries attended, their participation ensuring their silence. Blackmail became Alexander's favorite weapon. No one dared oppose a man who could expose their darkest sins with a whisper. Then there were the poisonings. Alexander and his son Caesar perfected the art of discreet murder, using a toxin they called la cantarella. Unlike crude arsenic, this slow-acting blend mimicked natural illness, leaving no trace. One victim, Cardinal Giovanni Borgia, ironically, a distant cousin, collapsed mid-banquet, his face turning blue as foam bubbled from his lips, the official cause. Sudden fever, the truth, he dared question Caesar's military campaigns. Even the Vatican's treasurer, a man who controlled the papal coffers, met a similar end after refusing to fund another of the Borgia's wars. But Alexander's most audacious crime was rewriting scripture itself, or at least selling it to the highest bidder. When King Charles VIII of France demanded the Pope annul his marriage so he could wed a wealthier bride, Alexander set a price, 200,000 ducats, and French support for Caesar's armies. The annulment was granted within weeks. Later, when the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella wanted papal backing for their conquest of the New World, Alexander simply drew a line down a map, the infamous Treaty of Tordesillas, splitting the globe between Spain and Portugal like spoils from a heist. The Vatican's cover-up began the moment Alexander died in 1503, ironically, from poisoned wine meant for someone else. Court scribes were ordered to burn entire ledgers. Painters reworked frescoes to erase Borgia symbols. Even the papal diary, the Liber Notarum, mysteriously skipped entire months of his reign. The greatest irony, the man who'd turned the Holy See into a criminal empire was given a full papal funeral, his crimes buried under centuries of whitewash. Because in the end, the Church understood one truth better than anyone: some sins are too monstrous to survive the historical record, and Alexander's weren't just sins, they were an indictment of the entire system. Prince Philip's public image was one of unwavering loyalty 73 years by Queen Elizabeth's side, the steadfast consort who mastered the art of royal discretion. But behind the carefully curated facade, whispers swirled for decades about children born on the wrong side of the crown, their existences erased through a combination of palace pressure and media collusion. One of the most persistent claims centers around a woman named Helene Cordet, a childhood friend of Philip's and later a nightclub singer in London. Her son, Max, bore an uncanny resemblance to the Duke, from the sharp Wittelsbach jawline to the distinctive hooded eyes. Though Cordet insisted Max's father was an unnamed British officer, Philip became the boy's godfather, an unusual role for a man with no blood ties. When Max died tragically young in 1959, Philip quietly arranged for his burial in the royal family's private cemetery at Windsor, fueling speculation that this was more than just charity. Then there's the case of Alexandra de Kent, a British aristocrat whose daughter, Sarah, shared Philip's piercing blue eyes and athletic build. While Sarah was officially the daughter of Alexandra's husband, rumors swirled that she'd been conceived during a months-long separation in the early 1960s, a period when Alexandra and Philip were known to have spent considerable time together. The palace's reaction: a sudden, unexplained withdrawal of Sarah's invitation to royal events, followed by a lucrative publishing deal for Alexandra that required her to omit certain dates from her memoir. Even more damning, a retired royal correspondent once admitted off record that editors at major British papers received strong guidance to avoid the story, with one tabloid killing a nearly finished investigation after a call from Buckingham Palace's press office. The most explosive allegations, however, emerged from Australia in the 1980s. A woman named Pat Kirkwood, a glamorous actress turned socialite, claimed she'd had a brief but intense affair with Philip during a royal tour in 1957, and that she'd given birth to a son the following year. Kirkwood's friends corroborated her story, recalling how she'd shown them letters signed P and a gold cigarette case engraved with the royal crest. When she attempted to publish her memoir in 2002, her publisher mysteriously backed out, citing legal concerns. Kirkwood died 2 years later, her son refusing interviews but reportedly receiving an anonymous trust fund established through a shell company in the Bahamas. What makes these stories so compelling isn't just the possibility of secret heirs, it's the machinery of suppression that kept them hidden. Former courtiers have admitted the palace maintained a gentleman's agreement with Fleet Street, offering exclusive access in exchange for discretion on certain topics. Private investigators were allegedly hired to track down and intimidate potential witnesses, while lawyers sent carefully worded letters hinting at libel suits few could afford to fight. Even when foreign press outlets picked up the stories, British media blackouts ensured they never gained traction at home, because in the end, the monarchy's power has always relied on illusion, the idea that bloodlines are clean, marriages unbreakable, and duty stronger than desire. And for an institution built on symbolism, the truth was a risk they couldn't afford to take. Queen Victoria's reign wasn't just defined by its length, it was shaped by a masterclass in image control. After Prince Albert's death in 1861, the public came to know her as the Widow of Windsor, a grieving monarch draped in perpetual black, withdrawing from public life to mourn. But behind the mourning veils and somber portraits lay a far more calculated reality. Victoria's seclusion wasn't just about grief, It was a strategic retreat, allowing her to wield power away from prying eyes, while her advisors sculpted a saintly image to pacify the public. Take her relationship with John Brown, the gruff Scottish servant who became her closest confidant, while official records downplayed their bond as mere employer and employee. Private letters and servant diaries tell a different story. Brown was given unprecedented privileges overseeing her private rooms, accompanying her on solitary rides, even speaking to her in a manner no other servant dared. When rumors swirled about their intimacy, the palace didn't deny them, it buried them. Courtiers were ordered to burn sensitive correspondence, and Victoria's private journal was later heavily edited by her youngest daughter, Beatrice, who meticulously scrubbed any mention of Brown that could be deemed improper. The few surviving scraps of unaltered text reveal a woman who relied on Brown not just for companionship but for blunt political advice, once writing that he alone understands the weight of sovereignty without the pretense. Then there was her alliance with Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, a partnership she carefully kept out of the public eye. While Victoria played the withdrawn widow, Disraeli fed her appetite for imperial expansion, famously flattering her with the title Empress of India. In return, she backed his policies with quiet fervor, even hosting secret meetings at Osborne House where they strategized over colonial acquisitions. The press was fed a different narrative, one of a queen too bereaved to engage in politics, leaving the gentleman to govern, but dispatches from foreign ambassadors tell another tale. Victoria's handwritten notes to Disraeli, often delivered by Brown himself, were filled with sharp critiques and bold directives. When Disraeli's rival, William Gladstone, attempted to expose her meddling, his memos mysteriously vanished from cabinet records. Even Victoria's children became pawns in this propaganda machine. Her eldest daughter, Vicky, was married off to Prussia's crown prince expressly to extend British influence, a move Victoria privately celebrated as planting our flag in Berlin's heart. Yet when Vicky's letters home revealed her mother's mercenary scheming, they were either censored or lost in transit. The Queen's younger sons, meanwhile, were packed off to the Navy or Army, their scandals, from gambling debts to illegitimate children, hushed up through a combination of payoffs and threats. One particularly damning episode involved Prince Leopold, whose haemophilia was blamed on hereditary misfortune, rather than the inbreeding Victoria had championed to keep power within European royalty. What makes Victoria's propaganda so effective wasn't just its scale, it was its adaptability. She allowed the public to see only what served her, the grieving widow, the matriarch of empire, the symbol of stability. Meanwhile, her private telegrams crackled with shrewd political maneuvering, her friendships defied protocol, and her grudges shaped foreign policy. By the time of her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, the myth had ossified into fact. The woman who'd once written, "I will not be dictated to, I will be queen," had mastered the ultimate royal trick, letting the world believe exactly what she wanted it to. And in that silence, she ruled unchallenged. When the Bolsheviks stormed the Ipatiev house in Yekaterinburg, they weren't just ending a dynasty, they were looting a fortune. The Romanovs' personal jewels alone were worth billions in today's currency, a staggering collection of Fabergé eggs, diamond tiaras, and uncut stones gathered over 3 centuries. Yet when the smoke cleared after the executions, only a fraction of this wealth ever made it to state coffers. The rest vanished into pockets, diplomatic pouches, and the hands of those who'd once sworn loyalty to the crown. Take the infamous Romanov emeralds, a set of Colombian gems the size of quail eggs, last seen sewn into Empress Alexandra's corset for safekeeping. They were reportedly ripped from her body after the murders. Yet when the Bolsheviks inventoried the family's possessions, the emeralds were conspicuously absent. Decades later, a matching set surfaced in the vaults of Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, Nicholas's cousin, who'd conveniently fled to Sweden months before the executions. Her descendants claimed they were family heirlooms, but palace records prove otherwise. The emeralds had been gifted exclusively to Alexandra. Then there's the matter of the sapphires. Princess Maria's blue diamond bracelet, a gift from her father for her 15th birthday, was documented in her final letter to a friend, but when the basement where the family died was examined, not a single sapphire was found. Fast forward to 1947, when a Dutch art dealer sold an identical bracelet to a Spanish duke, whose wife happened to be the niece of King Alfonso XIII, Nicholas's cousin. The duke's papers called it a legacy from Russian relatives, but the timing was damning. Alfonso's agents had been caught bribing Red Army officers during the Civil War, allegedly for cultural restitution. Most brazen of all was the disappearance of the imperial nuptial crown, a platinum and diamond masterpiece worn by every Romanov bride since the 1800s. Lost in the chaos of the revolution, it miraculously reappeared in 1926 at a Paris auction, listed anonymously. The buyer, a shell company later linked to British royals through a chain of intermediaries. Courtiers at Buckingham Palace insisted it was a humanitarian purchase to preserve history, but Soviet archives tell a different story. A memo from Stalin's secret police accused British intelligence of trading weapons to White Army holdouts in exchange for stolen Romanov jewels. The smoking gun, though, lies in the Fabergé eggs. Of the 52 commissioned by the family, only 43 were accounted for after the revolution. One, the Rothschild egg, mysteriously showed up in London in 2007 after being discovered in a scrap metal sale. But the most telling gap is the birch egg, last documented in Nicholas's private study. In 1934, a nearly identical egg was gifted to King George V's wife, Queen Mary, by a private collector. The royal inventory lists no provenance, only a handwritten note by Mary herself, from the ashes of Phoenix. What makes these missing jewels so explosive isn't just their value, it's the hypocrisy of their new owners. European royals who'd refused asylum to the Romanovs suddenly developed a keen interest in preserving their legacy through conveniently acquired treasures. Even now, museums and auction houses tiptoe around the origins of certain pieces, citing private donations or old collections, because the uncomfortable truth is this: while the Bolsheviks pulled the trigger, it was the Romanovs' own relatives who picked their pockets. And in the world of royal wealth, blood may be thicker than water, but diamonds, they're forever. King George III's reign should have been a golden age, a time of imperial expansion and Enlightenment ideals. Instead, it became a theatre of shadows, where courtiers and physicians conspired to hide the monarch's unraveling mind from the world. The king's descent into madness wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political time bomb. And the royal family's solution, a web of lies so elaborate it reshaped British history. The first signs appeared in 1788, when George began speaking nonsensically for hours, foaming at the mouth and insisting his conversations with trees were real. Court doctors diagnosed bilious fever, but their private notes told a different story. Pages from the royal physician's diary describe the king's skin turning blue from excessive leeching, his screams echoing through Windsor as attendants strapped him into a restraint chair. Yet official bulletins assured the public His Majesty suffered merely from temporary fatigue. The cover-up wasn't just about dignity, it was survival. News of an incapacitated monarch could fuel republican revolts like those brewing in France, where revolutionaries were already sharpening their guillotines. Enter the Phantom Council, a secret committee of advisors who ruled in George's name during his worst episodes. They forged his signature on decrees, staged carefully scripted appearances where the king would briefly appear composed, and paid off newspapers to print absurdly glowing reports. One notorious article in the Times claimed George had recovered so fully he'd danced a minuet with the Queen and recited Virgil from memory, a physical impossibility given his swollen legs and fragmented speech. Even more audacious was the palace's manipulation of Parliament. When opposition MPs demanded proof of the king's fitness, they were shown a 5-year-old portrait and told it was a recent likeness. The greatest deception, though, involved Prince George, the future king, desperate to prevent a regency that would shift power to his rebellious son. Queen Charlotte and her allies fabricated medical improvements to delay the transfer of authority. Doctors were bribed to testify the king's condition was reversible, while court painters altered portraits to hide his jaundiced skin and wild eyes. The ruse worked for years until 1810, when George's madness became too grotesque to conceal. Blind, delusional, and convinced London was underwater, he would sign imaginary treaties with angels while his physicians fed the public stories of gentle convalescence. What makes this cover-up so chilling isn't just the scale of the lies, it's how they warped the monarchy itself. George's illness forced the crown to perfect the art of illusion, trading transparency for control. And when the truth finally surfaced, the damage was done. The public's faith in royal infallibility had cracked, sowing seeds of distrust that would grow into the reform movements of the 19th century. Because once you've seen the man behind the curtain, it's hard to go back to believing in wizards. Princess Diana's 1995 interview with the BBC wasn't just television, it was a detonation that shattered the monarchy's carefully constructed image. Sitting in Kensington Palace's dimly lit drawing room, her words tore through decades of royal protocol like shrapnel. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she confessed, her voice steady as she exposed Prince Charles's affair with Camilla Parker Bowles. But the real shock wasn't the infidelity, it was the sheer audacity of a royal speaking uncensored truth. Overnight, 23 million viewers witnessed something unprecedented, a princess dismantling the institution from within. What few knew then was how cunningly that interview had been orchestrated, and not entirely by Diana. Journalist Martin Bashir had gained her trust with forged bank statements, falsely suggesting her staff were spying for Charles. This manipulation, revealed decades later, didn't negate Diana's truths, but highlighted how desperately she'd sought a platform. The palace, however, saw only betrayal. Within hours of the broadcast, senior courtiers convened an emergency meeting. Queen Elizabeth's private secretary reportedly drafted a letter that night urging the Queen to demand the couple's immediate divorce. Diana's phone lines to royal residences were disconnected, her engagements cancelled without notice, even her access to William and Harry's school schedules restricted. The retaliation extended beyond isolation. When Diana attempted to attend a public event at St. James's Palace weeks later, courtiers deliberately gave her the wrong arrival time, leaving her humiliated as photographers captured her waiting alone on the steps. Charity patronages she'd championed for years received discreet calls suggesting they distance themselves. Most chilling was the smear campaign anonymous briefings to favored journalists painting Diana as unstable and manipulative, a narrative amplified by establishment-friendly outlets. One notorious article quoted a senior palace source claiming she kept a list of lovers coded in a diary, a blatant falsehood later debunked, yet the cruelest cut came from her own family. Prince Philip, who'd once written Diana caring letters during her marital struggles, now authored scathing missives accusing her of bringing down the monarchy. Charles's allies floated rumors that her mental health made her unfit for parenting. while the Queen who'd privately tolerated decades of Windsor scandals suddenly deemed Diana's honesty irresponsible. The message was clear: truth-tellers had no place in the system, but the interview's aftershocks outlasted the retaliation. Diana's revelation about her bulimia and self-harm forced the royals to acknowledge mental health for the first time. Her admission of feeling no value within the institution sparked global debates about monarchy's human cost, and when she defiantly declared she'd remain the Queen of People's Hearts, she rewrote the royal playbook, proving influence could exist outside palace walls. The establishment might have frozen her out, but the public never did. In death as in life, Diana's voice proved louder than their silence, because some truths, once spoken, can never be taken back. Grigory Rasputin's death wasn't just a murder, it was a fiasco that exposed the desperation and incompetence of Russia's elite. On the icy night of December 30th, 1916, a group of nobles lured the so-called Mad Monk to the Moika Palace, promising him a meeting with Tsarina Alexandra's closest friend. What followed was a botched assassination so absurd it bordered on farce. Prince Felix Yusupov, the ringleader, first served Rasputin cyanide-laced cakes and wine, enough poison to kill 5 men. Yet when Rasputin kept eating, unfazed, Yusupov panicked and shot him in the back. The monk collapsed, only to revive moments later, choking Yusupov and fleeing into the snowy courtyard. Another conspirator, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, fired 3 more shots. Still, Rasputin clung to life until they finally drowned him in the Neva River, his body found days later with ice crystals forming on his tangled beard. The killers saw themselves as patriots, eliminating a peasant mystic they blamed for corrupting the royal family, but their clumsy conspiracy only deepened the Romanovs' crisis. Rasputin's influence over Alexandra was undeniable. He'd become her lifeline, promising his prayers could stop their hemophiliac son Alexei's bleeding. Letters reveal she trusted him so completely, she dismissed ministers who opposed him, writing to Nicholas at the front, "Our friend's advice is sent by God." Yet the murder didn't weaken Rasputin's myth, it supercharged it. Rumors spread that he'd prophesied his own death and warned the Tsar's downfall would follow within months. Peasants saw his killing as proof the aristocracy would stop at nothing to crush anyone who spoke for the downtrodden. Even soldiers at the front, already demoralized by war, whispered that the royal family was cursed. The assassination also exposed Nicholas's fatal indecision. Instead of punishing the killers, his own cousin Dmitri among them, he exiled them gently, fueling perceptions of a weak Tsar beholden to elites. Yusupov was sent to a luxurious estate, where he boasted of his heroism in letters. Meanwhile, Alexandra's grief warped into paranoia. She burned Rasputin's letters, fearing they'd be used against her, and doubled down on isolating the family from public opinion. The backlash was immediate. Just 6 weeks later, protests in Petrograd spiraled into revolution, with crowds chanting Rasputin's name as a symbol of court corruption. Historians still debate whether Rasputin's death hastened the Romanovs' end or merely punctuated it, but one thing is certain: the bungled murder didn't save the monarchy. It stripped away the last illusions of control, revealing a regime so rotten it couldn't even kill a peasant correctly. And when the Romanovs faced their own execution 18 months later, Rasputin's ghost loomed large, proof that no amount of bullets, poison, or royal power could silence the truths they'd tried so hard to bury. Wallis Simpson's story didn't end with Edward VIII's abdication, it spiraled into something far darker. While the world fixated on the king's scandalous love affair, British intelligence was tracking a far more dangerous thread: Wallis's clandestine ties to Nazi Germany. Declassified documents reveal she wasn't just a passive observer of Edward's fascist leanings, she was an active participant, weaving a web of espionage that stretched from London to Berlin. The first red flag came in 1935, years before the abdication. Wallis, then still married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson, attended a dinner party at the German embassy in London. Witnesses reported her enthralled conversation with Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's future foreign minister, who gifted her a bouquet of roses, one for every day of the week, a gesture she found charmingly persistent. By 1936, Ribbentrop was sending her coded telegrams signed Rib. Their contents so sensitive MI5 intercepted them under orders from Winston Churchill himself. One such message, decrypted decades later, referenced our mutual friend in Bavaria, a clear nod to Hitler, whom the couple would later meet in 1937. But Wallis's real value to the Nazis wasn't just social, it was strategic. As Edward's confidante, she had unparalleled access to state secrets. FBI files unearthed in the 1990s detail how she passed intelligence through her friend, the gossip columnist Elsa Maxwell, who doubled as a courier for German agents. One damning memo from 1938 describes Wallis briefing Ribbentrop on British naval defences, information she'd gleaned from Edward's unguarded remarks. Even after the abdication, her role expanded. During their post-marital exile in France, the couple's villa became a drop point for Nazi operatives. A maid's sworn testimony described seeing Wallis burning documents in the garden at midnight, the flames illuminating pages stamped with swastikas. The British government's cover-up was swift and systematic. When war broke out in 1939, Churchill ordered MI5 to seize the Duke and Duchess's correspondence, burying it in a restricted archive dubbed the Windsor File. Agents were dispatched to bribe or intimidate potential whistleblowers, including Wallis's own lawyer, who suddenly abandoned a tell-all memoir after a private conversation with intelligence officers. Even more revealing was the couple's wartime relocation to the Bahamas. Officially, Edward's governorship was a dignified post. In reality, it was exile, a move designed to keep them far from Nazi sympathizers. Yet Wallis still found ways to communicate, using a Swedish diplomat as a go-between for messages to Berlin. The most explosive evidence emerged in 2002, when a cache of German diplomatic cables was declassified. One, dated June 1940, detailed Wallis's plea to Ribbentrop. If the Führer holds back the invasion, the Duke is ready to negotiate peace. The implication was staggering Edward, and Wallis weren't just Nazi admirers. They were willing collaborators in a plot to undermine Britain's war effort. Why did the palace work so hard to suppress this? Because the truth wasn't just embarrassing, it was destabilizing. A former king conspiring with the enemy would have shattered public faith in the monarchy during Britain's darkest hour. So the files were locked away, witnesses silenced, and the Windsor's treason rewritten as mere poor judgment. But the documents don't lie. Behind the glamorous facade of the century's greatest love story lurked a betrayal so profound it nearly changed the course of history. And that's a secret too explosive for even the crown to fully erase. Beneath the grandeur of coronations and royal philanthropy lies a brutal truth. The British monarchy built its wealth on the backs of enslaved people. Queen Elizabeth I, often celebrated as the Virgin Queen who ushered in England's golden age, was also the first monarch to personally invest in the slave trade. In 1564, she lent her royal ships to John Hawkins, a pirate-turned-merchant, for his notorious voyages to West Africa. Hawkins returned with human cargo, trading captives in the Caribbean for sugar and tobacco, while Elizabeth took her cut of the profits, earning so handsomely she financed his next expedition and even knighted him. This wasn't just passive endorsement, it was active participation. Her successor, James I, went further, chartering the Company of Adventurers of London in 1612, granting it a monopoly on trafficking enslaved Africans to the Americas. The Crown's seal wasn't just on paperwork, it was branded onto human lives. By the 18th century, the monarchy's ties to slavery had become institutionalized. King Charles II and his brother, the future James II, were founding investors in the Royal African Company, a state-sponsored enterprise that shipped more enslaved Africans across the Atlantic than any other entity in history. Its logo, an elephant and castle literally stamped onto the flesh of those it transported, profits from these ventures flowed directly into royal coffers, financing palaces like Kensington and even paying for the coronation of George I. But the most grotesque twist came in 1833, when slavery was finally abolished in the British Empire, not with reparations for the enslaved, but with compensation for their enslavers. The British government paid out £20 million to plantation owners, a staggering sum equivalent to billions today, and among the recipients, Queen Victoria's own ancestors. The royal family's private secretary, Edward Hyde, received compensation for over 700 enslaved people in Jamaica, while distant cousins like the Earls of Harewood and Lascelles pocketed fortunes for lost property. Victoria herself, despite later championing abolitionist causes, quietly benefited from this blood money. The so-called Slave Compensation Act didn't just enrich aristocrats, it propped up the entire colonial economy that funded her empire. Portraits of the young queen often show her wearing elaborate jewels, but never the ledgers detailing how those gems were purchased with slavery's dividends. Even the construction of Osborne House, her beloved seaside retreat, was partially financed through colonial revenues rooted in forced labor, and when abolitionist movements gained momentum, the Crown's response was telling. While publicly supporting emancipation, privately, it lobbied for gradual, compensated phases to protect elite financial interests. The monarchy's attempt to distance itself from this history has been as calculated as its initial investments. Modern royal tours of the Caribbean carefully avoid former slave ports, while palace-approved biographies gloss over the origins of family wealth. In 2022, when Prince William expressed profound sorrow for slavery during a visit to Jamaica, activists noted the conspicuous absence of two words: apology and reparations. Archives detailing royal involvement remain partially sealed, with historians reporting unusual delays when requesting documents related to 19th century compensation claims. What makes this legacy so explosive isn't just its scale, it's the hypocrisy of an institution that still presents itself as a moral authority. The Crown's wealth wasn't built on divine right, but on a brutal system it helped design, profit from, and then erase from its own narrative. And when the accounts were finally settled, the only ones who ever got paid were those who'd done the enslaving, while the enslaved themselves were left with nothing but the weight of chains the monarchy refused to acknowledge. The image of Queen Elizabeth II as the stalwart, unshakable monarch was meticulously crafted over decades, yet beneath the surface, private letters reveal a woman grappling with the weight of duty in ways the public never saw. Leaked correspondence from her early reign, smuggled out of palace archives by a disgruntled staffer in the 1990s, paints a startlingly human portrait. In one 1957 note to her childhood governess, she confessed feeling like an imposter in my own skin after Prime Minister Anthony Eden's disastrous Suez crisis, admitting she'd wanted to intervene but feared overstepping constitutional bounds. The frustration simmered further in a 1963 letter to her mother, complaining that Harold Macmillan's sudden resignation due to illness left her bereft of steady hands as scandals rocked the Conservative Party. But her sharpest words were reserved for family. A 1982 memo to Prince Philip, penned during the Falklands War, lamented their son Andrew's shameful lack of gravitas as he partied in New York while British soldiers died overseas. Even more revealing were her private reactions to royal divorces. In a draft letter to Princess Diana never sent, but discovered in a locked desk drawer at Balmoral, she scrawled, "This endless theatre of spite does no credit to anyone," a rare flash of exasperation at the very spectacle she'd spent a lifetime upholding. The most explosive leak, however, came from her correspondence with Churchill. Their early exchanges, while cordial, show her chafing at his paternalism. By 1955, as his health failed, she wrote bluntly to a confidant, "He treats the empire as his chessboard and me as one of his pawns." Historians argue these cracks in her composure weren't weakness. They were the inevitable toll of a role that demanded superhuman restraint. Even her famed Annus Horribilis speech in 1992, acknowledging the fire at Windsor Castle and her children's crumbling marriages, was preceded by a private note calling the year a carnival of errors I am powerless to stop. What makes these letters so extraordinary isn't just their candor, it's the contrast they expose. The Queen's public persona was a masterclass in neutrality, yet her private writings thrummed with tension, regret, and occasional fury at the institution she'd sworn to protect. And that, perhaps, is her most relatable legacy, not the perfect monarch, but the woman who wore the crown anyway, ink-stained fingers and all. Prince Andrew's association with Jeffrey Epstein wasn't just a lapse in judgment, it was a ticking time bomb that detonated in the monarchy's lap with devastating precision. The Duke of York's ties to the disgraced financier spanned decades, from leisurely stays at Epstein's Manhattan mansion to vacations on his private island, all while the financier was under investigation for sex trafficking. What began as casual friendship in the early 2000s spiraled into a moral catastrophe, forcing Buckingham Palace into a damage control operation so frantic it exposed the institution's crumbling grip on modern accountability. At the heart of the scandal was Andrew's now infamous interview with BBC's Newsnight in 2019, a masterclass in tone-deaf deflection. Sitting in the plush surroundings of Buckingham Palace, the prince dismissed allegations with baffling confidence, insisting he had no recollection of meeting Virginia Giuffa, the woman who accused him of assault, despite a widely circulated photo showing them together with Epstein's accomplice, Ghislaine Maxwell. His claim that he couldn't sweat due to a military-induced condition, later debunked by medical experts, became a global punchline, but the real damage was subtler. The interview didn't just fail to exonerate him, it crystallized public perception of a royal utterly disconnected from reality. Behind the scenes, palace aides reportedly begged him to cancel the appearance, fearing disaster. They were right. The fallout was swift and merciless. Corporate sponsors fled Andrew's charitable initiatives, universities revoked his honorary degrees, and even his own family distanced themselves. Queen Elizabeth, long protective of her favorite son, made an unprecedented move, stripping him of military affiliations and royal patronages, effectively banishing him from public life. But the palace's attempts to quarantine the scandal only raised more questions. Why had Andrew been allowed to maintain ties with Epstein long after the financier's 2008 conviction? Why did senior courtiers approve his disastrous interview strategy? And most damningly, what did they know, and when? Leaked emails and court documents revealed a pattern of willful ignorance. Epstein had been introduced to Andrew through Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of media mogul Robert Maxwell, and a fixture in elite circles. Their friendship was an open secret, with Epstein even attending a Windsor Castle luncheon in 2011, 2 years after his conviction. Palace spokesman dismissed the meeting as a private gathering, but the optics were catastrophic. Worse still, Financial records showed Epstein had paid off £1 million debt for Andrew in 2010, a transaction the prince awkwardly claimed was a straightforward sale of a property. The timing, just as Epstein was negotiating his controversial plea deal, reeked of impropriety. The real cover-up, however, unfolded in plain sight. When Jurfa filed her civil lawsuit in 2021, Andrew's legal team deployed every delay tactic in the book challenging jurisdiction, attacking Jurfa's credibility, even attempting to invoke an obscure 2009 settlement between Epstein and his victims. When those maneuvers failed, Andrew settled out of court for a reported £12 million, though he admitted no wrongdoing. The payment, rumoured to be funded by the Queen's private estate, sparked outrage. Critics accused the monarchy of using sovereign immunity and closed-door deals to shield its own, while Epstein's victims fought for years in open court. What makes this scandal so corrosive isn't just Andrew's recklessness, it's the palace's failure to reckon with it. While other institutions cut ties with Epstein en masse after his arrest, the royals clung to outdated notions of discretion, as if silence alone could sterilize the stain. The Queen's death in 2022 offered a brief respite, but King Charles has shown zero appetite for rehabilitating his brother's image. Andrew remains confined to Royal Lodge, a spectral figure at family events, his name synonymous with the monarchy's worst instincts: entitlement, opacity, and a jarring disconnect from the public's moral compass. The Epstein affair exposed more than one man's poor choices. It revealed a system that prioritized reputation over justice, privilege over accountability. And in an era where crowns are no longer bulletproof, that may be the most dangerous secret of all. From hidden heirs to poisoned chalices, silenced scandals to stolen fortunes, the royal families of history perfected the art of illusion, where crowns weren't just symbols of power, but shields against the truth. We've uncovered mistresses banished to nunneries, children erased from genealogies, and monarchs who bargained with dictators to protect their thrones. These stories reveal a pattern more damning than any single scandal: institutions that demanded absolute loyalty from their subjects, yet seldom returned it. The deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes royalty's greatest talent wasn't ruling, but rewriting. They burned letters, paid off witnesses, and in some cases, eliminated those who knew too much, all to preserve a gleaming facade of divinity and decorum. But here's the unsettling question that lingers after the last document is unsealed and the final vault pried open. How much haven't we found? For every secret exposed, there are likely dozens still buried in locked archives, behind palace walls, or carried to the grave by those sworn to silence. Consider the British Crown's still classified files on Wallis Simpson's Nazi ties, or the Vatican's rumoured trove of Medici poison recipes. What about the Romanov treasures allegedly smuggled into other royal families' vaults, or the whispered truth behind Prince Andrew's elusive immunity? History teaches us that power doesn't surrender its secrets willingly, so now it's your turn. Which explosive royal secret do you think is still waiting to be uncovered? A lost heir? A suppressed assassination plot? Share your theories in the comments, because if there's one thing these scandals prove, it's that the truth never stays buried forever. And if you're hungry for more revelations, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we keep digging. After all, the most shocking chapters of history are often the ones they tried hardest to erase.